Before I tell you what Sterling Hadley found inside his truck, you need to understand how he got there. Because if you don't know the 19 years that came before the thing hidden behind that wall, won't mean what it's supposed to mean. So let me take you back to a Saturday morning in August of 1976 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, when a 26-year-old gas station mechanic made what everyone agreed was the dumbest purchase of the day. The Lackawanna County surplus auction was held in a gravel lot behind the county maintenance building, a flat, sun-beaten stretch of ground where the city dumped whatever it no longer wanted. Snowplows with seized engines, filing cabinets with broken drawers, office chairs missing wheels, the kind of stuff that had value once to someone and now sat baking in the August heat, waiting for a second chance that probably wasn't coming. Scranton itself was waiting for a second chance. The Lackawanna steel mill had closed 5 years earlier in 1971, erasing thousands of jobs in a single season. 5 years later, the town still hadn't recovered. Storefronts along Main Street had "for lease" signs taped to their windows. The immigrant families who'd built the neighborhood's Polish, Italian, Irish were still there, but the optimism that had brought them wasn't. People stayed because they were too rooted to leave and too stubborn to quit. They fixed pipes, repaired cars, sold scrap, and made do. Opening a business in Scranton in 1976 wasn't a dream. It was a gamble with bad odds and no safety net. Sterling Hadley was 26 years old and he worked at the Texaco station on Music Street. He'd been there 4 years, hired at 22, when the owner, a retired Army mechanic named Lloyd Greenfield, saw Sterling diagnose a transmission problem on a Buick Skylark without opening the hood. Sterling had listened to the engine for about 30 seconds, revved it twice and said, "Second gear synchro is gone. You can hear the grind when it downshifts." Lloyd hired him on the spot. Sterling had learned mechanics the way sons of mill workers learned everything in South Scranton, by standing next to their fathers and watching. By 15, he could rebuild a carburetor. By 18, he could diagnose engine trouble by sound, alone the way a musician can identify an instrument out of tune in an orchestra. By 21, he was the best mechanic at the Texaco, which meant he was also the lowest paid person doing the hardest work, and he knew it. 6 days a week, he changed oil, replaced brake pads, rotated tires, wiped his hands on rags that never got fully clean. The pay was enough to live on if you didn't want much, and Sterling didn't want much. He wanted one thing: a tow truck. His own tow truck, paid for, not financed, not leased, not borrowed. His. Under his pillow at home in the 2-bedroom house he shared with his father on Birch Street, Sterling kept a notebook. Not a diary, a business plan written in pencil on lined paper. He'd been working on it for 2 years. Lists of potential partner garages. Rate comparisons with every tow operator in Lackawanna County. Fuel cost estimates broken down by month. A hand-drawn map of South Scranton with circles around the neighborhoods he'd serve. The plan was thorough, detailed, and completely useless without capital. Sterling had $360 in savings. You couldn't buy a running wrecker for $360. You couldn't buy a running anything for $360. But you could buy something that nobody else wanted. The 1952 Holmes 440 sat at the far end of the auction lot, quarantined from the decent equipment like something contagious. The paint had faded from its original Holmes red to something closer to rust orange. 3 of the 4 tires were flat. The boom cable hung loose and frayed, swaying slightly in the hot breeze like a broken fishing line. The windshield had a crack running corner to corner, a single diagonal line that split the glass into 2 cloudy triangles. Someone from the city had spray painted City surplus as is across the driver's door in white block letters, and even those were peeling. The truck had been retired from city service in March of 1969. It had been sitting in a municipal garage for 7 years before someone decided to haul it out here and let the auction take care of it. 7 years without turning over. 7 Pennsylvania winters. 7 summers of heat expanding metal that cold had already cracked. The auctioneer, a heavy man in a straw hat who'd been working the crowd for 3 hours, barely tried. All right, folks, last item. 1952, Holmes wrecker retired from city service, 1969. Been sitting since then. Sold as is, no warranty, probably needs everything. He paused, scanning the thinning crowd. Do I hear 200? Silence. Come on, somebody needs a project. 100. A few dry chuckles. $50 for a piece of Scranton history. Sterling raised his hand. 200. The auctioneer looked surprised. I have 200. Do I hear 250? Nothing. 200 going once. 300. Sterling's voice again. People turned. The kid was bidding against himself. The auctioneer leaned into his microphone. Sir, you don't need to raise your own. 350. The laughter started. Not polite chuckling. Real laughter, the kind that bounces off metal and concrete and carries across an open lot. The laughter of people who recognize a fool and want him to know they recognize him. Sold, the auctioneer said quickly, to the young man in the back for $350. Sterling walked to the payment table and counted out 18 $20 bills, most of what he'd saved in 6 months at the Texaco. His hands were steady, his face showed nothing. That was when Corbin Thornburg found him. Corbin Thornburg was 45 years old and built like a man who'd once done physical labor but hadn't in a decade. He owned Thornburg's Heavy Recovery, the biggest tow operation in Lackawanna County. 6 wreckers, all Chevrolet, 6 O's, all newer than 1970, all painted the same dark blue with Thornburg's in gold letters on the doors. Corbin wore pressed work shirts with his name embroidered over the pocket. He drove a new Ford pickup. His hands were clean, his nails trimmed, and he had opinions about everything, especially about old equipment and especially about young men who didn't know their place. Sterling Hadley. Corbin said it loud enough for the dozen people still milling around the payment area to hear. Did you just spend $350 on that pile of rust? Yes, sir. Kid, do you know what $350 could buy you? Corbin didn't wait for an answer. That's 3 months of payments on a real wrecker. Something from this decade. Something that actually runs. He gestured toward his own truck in the parking lot, blue and gold gleaming. I've got a '74 Chevy C60 I could put you in. 200 a month, you'd be in business tomorrow. Sterling said nothing. Or better yet, Corbin continued, and his voice shifted into a register of false generosity, open-handed on the surface, controlling underneath. Come work for me. I need drivers. You know engines your old man taught you, right? 400 a week, steady pay, benefits. You'd be behind the wheel of a real truck by Monday. There it was, not just mockery, recruitment. Scranton was a small market, and Corbin Thornburg hadn't built the county's biggest tow operation by welcoming competition, even small competition, even one kid with one broken truck. Better to absorb him, better to turn a potential rival into an employee who'd build Corbin's business instead of his own. I can fix this one, Sterling said. Corbin laughed, the same big laugh that had bounced around the auction lot. Sterling, that wrecker hasn't run since Nixon was president. The engine's probably seized. The hydraulics are shot. You'd need $2,000 in parts just to get it to cough. I can fix it. No, you can't. Corbin stepped closer. Listen, I know your old man. Good mechanic. But you're 26 years old, you work at a gas station, and you just blew your savings on a wrecker that's worth maybe $100 in scrap metal. Come work for me. Learn the business the right way. Sterling looked at Corbin's pressed shirt, his clean fingernails, his confident, practiced smile, the smile of a man who'd never had to bid against himself because he'd always had enough money to outbid everyone else. My old man taught me something, Mr. Thornburg. He said the worst mistake you can make is paying someone else to own your tools. He walked past Corbin toward his rusted purchase, leaving the tow company owner standing by the payment table. Behind Sterling's van, Corbin turned to the lingering crowd and said with the easy certainty of someone who'd never been proven wrong about anything that mattered to him, "Give him 6 months." Most of the crowd had already moved on, but one person was still watching. Norma Loomis, 52 years old, owner of Loomis Auto Parts on Meadow Avenue, stood by her pickup with her arms folded and her eyes on the young man walking toward the worst truck in the lot. She didn't laugh. She didn't shake her head. She just watched, and she remembered his name. Sterling's father was waiting at home when Sterling pulled up with the borrowed tow dolly and the dead Holmes strapped to it. Clayton Hadley was 55 years old, thin in the way that men who've done physical labor their whole lives get thin when the labor stops, but the metabolism doesn't. He'd spent 30 years at the Lackawanna steel mill, every kind of work, furnace, tending crane operation equipment, maintenance, the jobs that eat your body one shift at a time and pay you just enough to come back tomorrow. When the mill closed in '71, Clayton started fixing cars in the garage behind the house. Anything that came through the door. Transmissions, alternators, water pumps, brake drums. He worked alone, he worked cheap, and he kept food on the table. Clayton taught the way the mill had taught him. No lectures, no theory, just hand the boy a wrench and say, "Take this apart." If Sterling asked why, Clayton would say, "Take it apart and you'll know." If Sterling made a mistake, Clayton would watch silent until Sterling found it himself. Then he'd say one sentence, just one, to seal the lesson. That was the method. Fail, find, fix, remember. Clayton had one rule he actually said out loud, the only piece of philosophy Sterling ever heard from a man who didn't believe in philosophy. The worst mistake you can make is paying someone else to own your tools. Sterling heard it first when he was 10. He heard it again at 12, at 15, at 20. It wasn't advice, it was scripture. Clayton also coughed every morning. A dry, hacking cough that started when he woke and lasted through his first cup of coffee. Dust from the mill. 30 years of breathing things the human lung was never meant to process. Clayton never mentioned it, never saw a doctor about it. The cough was just part of the morning, like the sunrise, like the coffee, like the sound of the house settling. Sterling heard it every day, the way you hear a clock ticking. So constant it becomes invisible. He didn't know yet that it was getting worse. It took 3 men to push the Holmes off the trailer. The wheels were locked, the parking brake frozen solid, and the truck resisted every inch like it had decided it was done moving forever. They wrestled it into Clayton's garage, scraping the concrete floor, and when they finally got it positioned under the overhead light, Sterling stood back and looked at what he'd bought. It was worse than it looked at the auction. The engine was seized. 7 years of sitting had fused the pistons to the cylinder walls, metal bonded to metal through corrosion and time. The hydraulic system was packed with rust and sludge. Every seal cracked the pump, frozen. The wiring harness was a tangle of frayed connections in green corrosion. The brake lines had rotted through completely, leaving nothing but copper-colored dust where rubber used to be. The boom winch was the only thing that looked salvageable, entirely mechanical. No power assist, just gears and cables, simple engineering that that outlast neglect better than anything with seals or electronics. That first night, Sterling stood in the garage staring at the truck for a long time. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. The garage smelled like old oil and cold concrete, and the voice in his head sounded exactly like Corbin Thornburg. 2 grand in parts just to get it to cough. You're 26 and you work at a gas station. Give him 6 months. Sterling picked up a wrench from the workbench and threw it at the garage wall. It hit the cinder block with a sharp crack that echoed in the small space, then clattered to the floor. The sound rang in his ears. He heard footsteps behind him. Clayton had come out of the house in his slippers, drawn by the sound of a tool hitting a wall, which in Clayton's world was roughly equivalent to hearing someone scream. Clayton looked at the wrecker for a long time. Then he looked at his son. Then he walked to where the wrench had fallen, picked it up, and placed it back in the toolbox in its correct slot between the 3/4 inch and the 7/8. He didn't say anything about the throwing. He didn't need to. Tools are not for throwing, no matter how angry you are. Sterling understood. Clayton looked at his son. He could see the frustration, the doubt, the anger that comes from spending everything you have on a bet and immediately wondering if you've lost. Clayton had seen that look before. In the mirror in 1971, the morning after the mill closed, when he'd stood in his bathroom and realized that 30 years of loyalty had bought him nothing but a cough and a pension that wouldn't cover the mortgage. Then Clayton put his hand on the faded hood of the Holmes. You know what this is? Sterling's jaw was tight. A piece of junk. No, this is a 1952 Holmes built in Chattanooga, Tennessee. We had 2 of these at the mill for moving heavy equipment. Simple, strong, no computers, no nonsense. Just iron and steel and engineering from a time when they built things to last. Clayton's hand stayed on the hood palm flat, steady, the gesture of a man calming something alive. This truck will run another 50 years if you treat it right. How do I fix it? The same way I fixed everything at the mill, one piece at a time. A week later, Sterling walked into Loomis Auto Parts on Meadow Avenue. The shop was small, crammed floor to ceiling with the shelves of used parts organized by a system that made sense only to Norma Loomis. Alternators next to hubcaps, brake drums beside radiator hoses, a counter made from a repurposed church pew. The air smelled like metal and WD-40. Norma looked up from a parts catalog. She recognized him immediately. You're the kid who bid against himself at the auction. Sterling nodded. He felt the heat rise in his neck, the specific embarrassment of being recognized for the worst moment of your week by someone you need to impress. I also saw Corbin Thornburg try to recruit you, Norma added, reshuffling invoices behind the counter. And I saw you walk away from him. That's the part most people didn't notice. She set the invoices aside. I noticed. Norma didn't smile, didn't laugh. She studied him with the sharp attention of someone who measures people by what they do, not what they say. Holmes 440 right, 52. Yes, ma'am. I've got piston rings that'll fit. Hydraulic seals, a water pump. What else do you need? Sterling gave her the list. It was long. Norma went through it item by item, checking her inventory, pulling boxes from shelves, stacking parts on the counter. When she was done, the stack was impressive. Sterling asked the price. Norma looked at him. How much do you have? Sterling was honest. He'd learned from Clayton that lying about money was the fastest way to lose people's trust. Almost nothing. I put everything into the truck. Norma was quiet for a moment. She looked at the stack of parts, then at Sterling, then at the stack again. Take the parts. Pay me when you get your first tow call. But if you quit on that truck halfway through, I'll find you and charge double. Sterling carried the parts to his truck. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from something closer to gratitude. Norma Loomis was the first person outside his own family to bet on him. That meant something. In a town where most people had stopped betting on anything, it meant everything. That same week, Sterling's life got more complicated. Vivian Brantley, 24, his girlfriend of 2 years, worked as a secretary at the hospital. They'd been saving together for a wedding. The plan was simple. Save enough, get married at St. Stanislaus, rent a small apartment, start a life. The plan required money, and Sterling had just spent most of their money on a truck that couldn't move. Vivian didn't yell. She spoke in the low, controlled voice of a woman who was too angry to raise her voice. "We agreed to save for the wedding, Sterling. We agreed, and you took the money and bought a truck that doesn't start." Sterling tried to explain. "The business plan, the homes, the opportunity, the future." Vivian cut him off. "The whole town is laughing at you, Sterling. Do you understand that? Not behind your back." "To my face," Corbin Thornburg told Bobby Crane at the diner that you'd be begging for a job by Christmas, and Bobby told his wife, and his wife works at the hospital with me. "Do you know what it's like to sit in a break room and have 3 women look at you with pity because your boyfriend spent his savings on a truck that hasn't moved since 1969? Sterling opened his mouth. Vivian held up her hand. "I'm not done. My mother called. She asked if you were drinking, because that's the only explanation she could think of for a grown man spending $350 on scrap metal. I told her you weren't drinking. I told her you had a plan. And she said, Vivian, men with pays and no money are just dreamers with calluses." "Corbin Thornburg wants me to work for him," Sterling said. "That's why he's laughing. He doesn't want competition." Competition. Vivian's voice cracked just slightly. "Sterling, you have one broken truck and no money. That's not competition. That's a fantasy." She didn't leave him. She didn't threaten to. But she said a condition delivered in the same low voice with her eyes locked on his. "1 year. If that truck isn't running in 1 year, you sell it for scrap and we go back to the plan." "The real plan," Sterling agreed. The clock started. For the next 12 months, Sterling rebuilt the Holmes 440. He worked at the Texaco from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, 6 days a week. Lloyd Greenfield, the station owner, knew about the Holmes project and quietly scheduled Sterling for the early shift so he could be home by 4:30. Lloyd never said why. He never mentioned it. But Sterling noticed, and he understood that kindness didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just rearranged a shift schedule without explanation. Sterling drove home, ate whatever was in the refrigerator, and walked into the garage. He worked until 11 at night, sometimes midnight. His hands developed a permanent smell of solvent and grease that no amount of soap could remove. Vivian said she could tell when he was close by, with her eyes closed just from the smell. She said it the way people report facts without judgment, but also without affection. Not yet. Saturdays after his shift, all day Sunday, every spare hour his body could produce, he pulled the engine completely, disassembled it on the garage floor piece by piece, laying each component on newspaper in the order it came out so he could put it back in reverse. The kitchen table became a parts catalog. Vivian would come home from the hospital to find valve springs next to the salt shaker and a piston ring soaking in solvent where the fruit bowl used to be. She moved them without comment for the first month. By the second month, she designated one end of the table as Sterling's and put a strip of masking tape down the middle. By the third month, the tape had migrated steadily towards Sterling's easton until he had about 8 inches of table and Vivian had the rest. Neither of them mentioned it. It was their first negotiation as a couple conducted entirely without words, and Sterling lost comprehensively. The parts that couldn't be sourced from Norma's shop had to be fabricated. Clayton machined a new camshaft bearing from a solid block of bronze using a lathe he had smuggled out of the steel mill on his last day in 1971. The lathe was technically city property. Clayton considered it severance pay for 30 years of breathing poison. No one had ever come looking for it. The pistons were the worst. 7 years of corrosion had welded them to the cylinder walls, and freeing them required penetrating oil patience and force applied in exactly the right sequence. Clayton supervised mostly in silence. He'd hand Sterling a tool when Sterling needed one sometimes before Sterling knew he needed it. Occasionally he'd say, "Not tight enough," or "half turn more." That was the extent of the conversation. Two men in a garage working on an engine communicating through metal and motion. In March of 1977, around month 7, Sterling made his first serious mistake. He was exhausted running on 4 hours of sleep, and he installed a gasket backwards. Reversed the orientation, which would have caused an oil leak the moment the engine turned over. Clayton was standing 3 feet away. He saw the error immediately. He said nothing. 20 minutes later, Sterling stopped, stared at the gasket, realized what he'd done. He cursed under his breath, pulled the gasket, cleaned the surface, and reinstalled it correctly. Only then did Clayton speak. "Now you'll never forget which way it goes." That was the method. Let the boy fail. Let the boy find it. Seal the lesson with one sentence. Norma's parts kept the project moving. Sterling repaid her not with money but with labor, spending his Sunday afternoons at her shop fixing cars for her customers free of charge. It was his first business relationship built not on capital but on exchange. Trust for trust. Work for work. Norma kept quiet track of what Sterling owed, and Sterling kept quiet track of what he'd repaid, and neither of them ever mentioned the numbers to each other. Vivian came to the garage some evenings with dinner in a paper bag, sandwiches, sometimes soup in a thermos. She didn't stay long and she didn't say much. She was still skeptical, still angry in a way that had settled into something quieter and more complicated than the initial explosion. But she watched. She noticed that Sterling never missed a night in the garage, never skipped a weekend, never complained, never wavered. The anger she felt toward the decision began to separate from what she felt toward the man. She didn't trust the truck, but she was beginning to trust the kind of person who would refuse to quit on it. One evening in June, Vivian sat on a folding chair in the corner of the garage while Sterling and Clayton worked on the hydraulic pump. She asked Clayton quietly, not wanting to interrupt, "Do you think the truck will actually run?" Clayton didn't look up from the pump. "It'll run." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure about my son. The truck is just iron and steel." August 1977. 12 months since the auction. The last day of Vivian's deadline, though, Sterling hadn't reminded her and she hadn't mentioned it. The Holmes sat in the garage fully reassembled, every system rebuilt, every wire reconnected, every seal replaced. The paint was still faded, the windshield crack was still there. But under the hood, the engine was clean, the cylinders bored true, the valves ground smooth. Sterling climbed behind the wheel. The vinyl was cracked and the foam showed through in places, but the seat held him. He put his hand on the key. Clayton stood in the garage doorway, arms crossed, his silhouette backlit by the evening sun. Vivian stood behind Clayton slightly to the left, her arms wrapped around herself. Sterling turned the key. The starter cranked. The engine coughed once, a rough, throaty sound like a man clearing his lungs after a long sleep. Then again smoother. Then it caught, and the idle settled into a deep, steady rumble that filled the garage and vibrated through the concrete floor and up through the soles of Sterling's boots and into his chest. The Holmes 440 was running. Clayton nodded once, a small nod, and the faintest trace of a smile crossed his face so brief you'd miss it if you blinked. But Sterling didn't blink. "Now you're in business," Clayton said. Behind him, Vivian bit her lower lip and nodded slowly, the nod of a woman admitting she'd underestimated someone. She didn't say much, just two words quiet enough that only she could hear them. "All right." That was enough. Sterling painted Hadley Recovery on the doors in hand, brushed white letters using a signwriting brush Norma gave him, and a technique he learned from a library book checked out 3 times. The letters weren't perfect. The R in recovery leaned slightly to the left, and the Y was bigger than the other letters. But they were legible, and they were his. He got his commercial tow license from the county, a process that required 3 trips to the municipal building, 2 notarized forms, and a $30 fee that he paid in 1s and 5s. The clerk behind the counter looked at the pile of small bills and then at Sterling and said, "First-time business owner." Sterling nodded. The clerk stamped the form without further comment. He printed business cards at Kinko's 50 cents for 100 black ink on white cardstock. He left stacks of them at every gas station, garage, and body shop in South Scranton. Most of them ended up in trash cans. A few ended up on refrigerators. That was enough. And he started taking calls. The first call came from Norma. A customer of hers had broken down on Pittston Avenue. A dead alternator needed a tow to the shop. Sterling drove the Holmes across town, hooked the car, pulled it back to Norma's. Total time 40 minutes. When he was done, he walked into Norma's shop and laid $35 on the counter. "Toward what I owe you." Norma picked up the bills, counted them, tucked them in the register. "You still owe $280. "Next call," Sterling said. "Then go get one." The work came slowly. A breakdown on the boulevard. A car in a ditch on the turnpike. Dead batteries. Flat tires. The small jobs, the ones that weren't worth Corbin Thornburg's time. The ones that paid $35 instead of $75. The ones that came from the neighborhoods where people knew your name and called you because their cousin's neighbor said you were fair. Sterling took every call. He never turned down a job. He never overcharged. He answered his phone at 2 in the morning and drove into sleet at 4. The Holmes ran, month after month, mile after mile. The engine Clayton had helped him rebuild turned over every time he asked it to. The mechanical boom winch. No electronics, no hydraulics, just gears and cable, and a hand crank lifted every car he hooked to it. The truck was slow. It was loud. It burned oil at a rate that would horrify a modern mechanic. But it worked. And working Sterling was learning was the only thing that mattered. A few weeks after his first call, Sterling was towing a stalled sedan off Pittston Avenue when he saw a dark blue pickup truck slow down on the other side of the road. Corbin Thornburg behind the wheel watching. Sterling kept working. He didn't wave, didn't acknowledge, just hooked the sedan and drove. But in his mirror, he saw something he hadn't expected. Corbin wasn't laughing. He wasn't shaking his head. He was just watching the way a man watches something he dismissed that has started to prove him wrong. Corbin sat there for a long moment, his truck idling, his expression unreadable. Then he drove away. For the first time since the auction, Corbin Thornburg wasn't laughing at Sterling Hadley. And Sterling, pulling a dead sedan behind a 30-year-old wrecker with hand-painted letters on the door, understood what that silence meant. Corbin had realized that Sterling wasn't playing. He was beginning. The first winter nearly killed the business before it had a chance to become one. December 1978. Sterling had been running Hadley Recovery for a little over a year, and the calls were coming in steadily enough to keep the lights on, but not steadily enough to let him sleep without worry. Most nights he lay in bed next to Vivian, staring at the ceiling, running numbers in his head. $35 a call, average 4 calls a week in summer, sometimes 5. But winter changed the math. Roads got dangerous, which meant more accidents, more breakdowns, more need. It also meant ice on the boom, cables, frost on the windshield that took 20 minutes to clear, and mornings when the cold hit so hard that stepping outside felt like walking into a wall. But the Holmes started every time, every single time. Sterling turned the key in temperatures that would have killed a newer truck's battery management system, and the old engine turned over with the stubbornness of a machine that didn't know it was supposed to be obsolete. It burned more oil in the cold. The heater barely worked. The cab was drafty enough that Sterling drove in 2 coats, a wool hat, and gloves with the fingertips cut off so he could work the controls. None of that mattered. What mattered was that when the phone rang at 3 in the morning and someone was stranded on the Scranton Expressway in 12-degree weather, Sterling could be there in 20 minutes. And he was, every time. That reputation started small and grew the way reputations do in tight neighborhoods, where people talk over fences and in church parking lots and at the counter of the corner deli. Sterling Hadley shows up. Sterling Hadley doesn't gouge you. Sterling Hadley pulled Mrs. Dunlap off the bridge at 2 in the morning and didn't charge her a dime. Mavis Dunlap was 72 years old and drove a 1971 Plymouth Valiant that should have been retired around the same time she should have stopped driving, which was several years ago. On a night in January 1979, the temperature 15 below zero, her Valiant died on the North Scranton Bridge. Battery. Mavis called information, got Sterling's number from the card her neighbor had on the refrigerator and called. Sterling arrived in 18 minutes. He jumped the battery, waited until her engine was warm, followed her home to make sure she made it. Mavis held out a $10 bill. Sterling shook his head. "Keep it, Mrs. Dunlap. Get yourself some coffee to warm up." The next week, 4 of Mavis's neighbors called Sterling. The week after that, 3 more. Each one mentioned Mavis. Each one said the same thing. Mavis said, "You're the one to call." That was how Sterling built his business. Not with advertising, not with contracts, not with a fleet of matching trucks and gold lettering. With a 72-year-old woman and a $10 bill he didn't take. The math of generosity was counterintuitive but reliable. A free battery jump cost Sterling 20 minutes and no money. It generated 4 paying customers the following week, each worth $35, $140 from 20 minutes of free work. No business school in the country taught that equation, but every small operator in every blue-collar neighborhood in America knew it by heart. Corbin Thornburg, meanwhile, was expanding. By 1980, Thornburg's heavy recovery had grown to 10 wreckers, all Chevrolets, all financed, all painted the same dark blue. Corbin had signed contracts with the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission and 2 insurance companies. He'd leased a new building on Moosic Street with a proper dispatch office and a waiting room with coffee and magazines. On paper, Thornburg's was thriving. Under the paper, every truck had a monthly payment, the building had a 5-year lease, and the overhead required a constant flow of revenue that left no margin for a slow month. Sterling knew none of this at the time. He knew only that Corbin Thornburg's trucks were everywhere, blue and gold, on every highway ramp, and that his own single red wrecker looked like a relic by comparison. But the relic was paid for, and the relic kept running. Then Nash Kincaid showed up. Nash Kincaid was 40 years old and had been a city vehicle inspector for 12 years. He was the kind of man who read regulations with genuine interest and total retention, the way some people read novels. Nash didn't have enemies because he didn't have enough personality to provoke anyone. He had a clipboard, a checklist, a municipal badge, and an absolute inability to see gray areas. Everything was pass or fail. Everything was coder violation. Nash Kincaid was not corrupt. He was not cruel. He was simply someone who believed rules existed for a reason and that the reason was always sufficient. In the spring of 1980, Nash arrived at Clayton's garage for a routine commercial vehicle inspection. He walked around the Holmes with his clipboard checking lights, reflectors, brake response, tire tread, depth, boom, mechanism safety. The inspection took 30 minutes. When he was done, Nash stood in front of Sterling and delivered his verdict without emotion, without apology, with the complete certainty of a diagnosis. Turn signals don't meet Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 108 adopted 1968. Brake system lacks a dual-circuit master cylinder required under FMVAO SS 105 for commercial vehicles. I can't renew your operating permit. Nash clicked his pen and made a note. You have 60 days to bring the vehicle into compliance. If you don't, I pull the license. Sterling felt the floor shift under him. Not physically, something deeper. The business was 14 months old. He had regulars now, people who depended on him. Losing the permit meant losing everything. Going back to the Texaco, going back to changing oil for someone else, going back to being the kid Corbin Thornburg said would fail. The truck is safe, Sterling said. I rebuilt every system on it. I don't doubt that, Mr. Hadley, but safe and compliant aren't the same thing. The law requires specific equipment. Your truck doesn't have it. 60 days. Nash left. Sterling stood in the garage, the inspection failure notice in his hand, and tried to figure out how to buy parts he couldn't afford for a truck that ran perfectly, but didn't meet a standard written 16 years after it was built. He went to Norma. She didn't have the specific components, dual-circuit brake valve, updated lighting assembly, but she knew who might. There's a military surplus yard in Wilkes Barre. They strip decommissioned Army trucks. A 1960 Deuce and a Half would have compatible parts. Take the drive. Sterling drove to Wilkes Barre on his day off, found the yard, found the parts of brake valve and signal assembly from a 1960 Army M35 that matched the Holmes bolt pattern close enough to work. The owner wanted $200. Sterling paid with money from extra weekend shifts at the Texaco shifts he'd picked up specifically because he could feel this kind of emergency coming even before Nash Kincaid walked through the door. It was Norma who told him later over coffee in her shop, who had likely sent Nash his way. Corbin Thornburg drinks with Nash Kincaid every Friday night at Patty's Tavern on Main Street. You don't think that's a coincidence, do you? Sterling didn't answer. He didn't need to. He understood now that Corbin Thornburg's interest in him hadn't ended at the auction. The laughter, the job offer, the condescension, those were the visible moves. The invisible ones were quieter. A casual mention at a bar. Hey, Nash, you ever inspect that old Holmes the Hadley kid is running? Things gotta be 30 years out of key. Not a formal complaint, not a sabotage you could point to. Just a nudge delivered over a beer from a man who understood that bureaucracy could do what mockery couldn't. Sterling installed the parts in 38 days. Nash returned, inspected, nodded. Compliant. Permit renewed. He turned to leave, then stopped in the doorway. Mr. Hadley, I don't comment on who sends me where, but that truck of yours now meets every standard I check, which is more than I can say for half the commercial vehicles in this county, including some of the newer ones. Nash walked out. Sterling stood in the garage holding his renewed permit and understanding two things he hadn't understood before. First, that Corbin Thornburg considered him enough of a threat to act against. Second, that surviving the act had made him stronger. That evening, Sterling told Clayton about the inspection and what Norma had said about Corbin and Nash at Patty's Tavern. Clayton listened, wiping his hands on a rag, his face unreadable. When Sterling finished, Clayton said one word. Good. Good. When a man spends effort trying to stop you, it means you're moving. Nobody wastes a bullet on something that isn't going anywhere. Clayton folded the rag and set it on the workbench. Worry when he stops noticing you. That means you're already finished. It was the longest strategic observation Clayton had ever made, and Sterling filed it away in the same part of his mind where he kept everything his father taught him, next to torque specifications and valve clearances, and the understanding that a man's tools belong to him and no one else. In 1981, Sterling and Vivian married at St. Stanislaus Church. Small ceremony, 40 guests, family and neighbors, reception in the church basement with pierogies and kielbasa and a cake from the Polish bakery on Cedar Avenue that cost more than Sterling wanted to spend, but less than Vivian deserved. Vivian wore her mother's dress, altered to fit by Mrs. Andruski 3 doors down, who did it for free because Sterling had towed her son's car out of a snowbank the previous winter without charging. Sterling wore a suit borrowed from his cousin, slightly too big in the shoulders, and shoes he'd polished with motor oil because he couldn't find shoe polish and didn't know the difference. Clayton sat in the front pew and coughed quietly into a handkerchief during the vows. When the priest asked if anyone objected, Clayton coughed louder, and several people turned to look. It was not an objection, it was just his lungs. But the timing made Vivian laugh, and the sound of her laughter in the old stone church was the thing Sterling remembered most about the wedding, more than the vows, more than the ring, more than the cake. Her laughter filling the space where his mother should have been sitting. In 1982, Harlan was born. 7 pounds 4 ounces full head of dark hair, lungs strong enough to wake the maternity ward. Sterling held his son for the first time in a hospital hallway while Vivian slept and felt the weight of the boy shift something in his chest that he couldn't name. The world had new stakes now, higher ones. The business wasn't just about pride anymore, or proving Corbin wrong, or honoring his father's philosophy. It was about feeding a child, about keeping a family warm, about making sure this boy grew up in a house where the lights stayed on. Vivian wanted Sterling to take Corbin's offer. Not the one from the auction that was years ago, but a new one. Thornburg's was hiring drivers at $400 a week, nearly double what Sterling cleared in a good month of tow calls. We need health insurance, Sterling. The baby needs a pediatrician. We can't keep running on hope in a 30-year-old truck. If I go work for Corbin, I drive his trucks, follow his schedule, charge his rates. Everything I built disappears. Vivian looked at him across the kitchen table, Harlan asleep in her arms. She didn't issue an ultimatum this time. She didn't set a deadline. Instead, she went quiet. For a week, she didn't bring dinner to the garage, didn't answer the tow line in the evenings, didn't mention the business at all. The silence was louder than any argument. Sterling felt the distance between them like a physical gap widening with each day, and it scared him more than Nash Kincaid's inspection notice ever had. Then one night, Sterling came home at 11 from a late call, walked into the kitchen, and found Vivian sitting at the table with his tow logbook open in front of her. She had a pencil and a piece of paper. She was adding up the month's revenue, sorting calls by neighborhood, noting which customers had called more than once. She didn't look up when he came in. She just kept writing. Sterling watched her for a moment. Then he sat down across from her and waited. Vivian finished her column of numbers, circled a total, and pushed the paper toward him. You're losing money on the west side calls. Too far, too much gas, not enough volume. Focus on South Scranton and the Hill section. That's where your repeats are. She'd made her choice. Not with words, with action. From that night on, Vivian answered the phone, kept the books tracked, expenses, sent invoices, and managed the schedule. She didn't do it because she believed in the Holmes. She did it because she believed in Sterling and because she'd realized that fighting his stubbornness was less productive than directing it. By 1985, the operation had grown enough to need help. Sterling hired Garrett Strickland, 22 years old, recently discharged from the Army, looking for work that involved engines and irregular hours. Garrett was everything Sterling was not. Loud where Sterling was quiet. Chatty where Sterling was terse. The kind of man who could talk to a stranded motorist for 20 minutes about nothing and make them feel like they'd made a friend. He called the Holmes Old Red and talked to it like a person patting the dashboard before starting a shift and saying things like, "All right, old girl, let's go save somebody." Sterling found it annoying for the first 2 weeks. Then he noticed that customers were asking for the friendly one when they called back. Garrett handled people. Sterling handled machines. The combination worked. Sterling also bought a second wrecker that year, a 1965 International Harvester, paid cash, no financing, 2 trucks, 1 employee, 1 phone line that rang in his kitchen. Still no building, still no office, still operating out of Clayton's garage. The overhead was so low it was almost invisible, and that was the point. Then came the night that changed everything. November 1987. The weathermen had been warning about it for 2 days, but weathermen in Scranton warned about storms constantly and usually about nothing. This time was different. This time was different. The storm hit on a Tuesday evening and didn't stop until Wednesday afternoon. 14 inches of snow, wind gusts over 60 miles per hour, temperatures that dropped to 20 below zero by midnight. Interstate 81 turned into a parking lot of abandoned and stranded vehicles within 3 hours. The Scranton Expressway was impassable. Side streets disappeared under drifts that buried mailboxes and stop signs. Thornburg's heavy recovery had 10 wreckers. On paper, that was enough to handle anything. In practice, 6 of those 10 trucks wouldn't start. The newer Chevrolets had electronic ignition systems, computerized fuel injection, temperature sensors, and battery management modules. All of it sophisticated, all of it fragile. The cold killed the electronics quietly and completely without announcement. Corbin Thornburg stood in his heated dispatch office on Moosic Street, calling his drivers, listening to them tell him one by one that the trucks wouldn't turn over. At the Hadley house on Birch Street, the phone rang at 7 in the evening. Vivian answered, wrote down the information, and handed Sterling the slip. He put on his boots, his 2 coats, his wool hat, and walked into the garage. He turned the key on the Holmes. The old engine caught on the first try the way it always did because there was nothing in it that could be confused by the cold. No computer, no sensor, no module, just metal and combustion and the willingness to work. Sterling and Garrett drove into the storm and didn't come home for 18 hours. They pulled 14 vehicles off roads, out of ditches and away from guardrails that night. 14 families, 14 emergencies, 14 moments when someone saw headlights approaching through the snow and felt the specific kind of relief that only comes when you've been alone in the cold long enough to wonder if anyone is coming at all. The 5th call was a delivery truck jackknifed across both lanes of the expressway, blocking everything behind it. Sterling hooked the cab while Garrett directed the backed-up traffic with a flashlight and a voice that carried over the wind. It took 40 minutes to clear the road. The delivery driver, a man in his 60s with a company jacket and shaking hands, said he'd been driving trucks for 30 years and never seen a storm this bad. Sterling told him to sit in the Holmes' cab and warm up while they finished. The old man sat there for 20 minutes, hands wrapped around a coffee thermos, staring at the dash gauges and the hand crank for the winch and the cracked windshield. When Sterling came back, the driver said, This truck is older than I am. Sterling said, it's also still running. The ninth call was the one Sterling would remember longest. A sedan on I-81 slid off the shoulder into a drainage ditch that was quickly filling with snow. Inside the car, a father, a mother, two children under 10. The car was tilted at an angle, the exhaust pipe partially buried, and the engine was running because the father was afraid to turn it off and lose the heat. Sterling killed the sedan's engine, first explained the carbon monoxide risk in 4 words: exhaust blocked engine off, then hooked the tow cable and brought the Holmes winch to bear. The old mechanical winch groaned, the cable went taut, and the sedan came up out of the ditch 1 inch at a time. Garrett wrapped the children in blankets Vivian had packed and gave the mother coffee from a thermos. The father stood in the snow watching his car rise from the ditch and grabbed Sterling's arm. I thought we were going to freeze out here tonight. I thought nobody was coming. Somebody's always coming, Sterling said. He meant it. The 12th call was the one Sterling never mentioned to anyone. Not to Vivian, not to Garrett, not to Norma. The vehicle was a Chevrolet C60 dark blue with gold lettering on the doors. One of Corbin Thornburg's trucks broken down on the shoulder of the expressway, the driver sitting inside with the engine dead, and the heater gone, and the cab getting colder by the minute. The driver was a young man Sterling didn't recognize, probably new, probably hired in the last few months. He looked at the Holmes with wide eyes when it pulled up and looked at the name on the door and understood exactly what was happening. Sterling hooked the Chevy without a word, towed it to Thornburg's lot on Moosic Street, unhooked it, drove away. He didn't leave a bill. He didn't leave a note. He didn't mention it to Corbin. But the driver mentioned it. Drivers always mention things like that. The morning after the storm, the Scranton Times-Tribune ran a piece about the night. It was a short article, page 3, mostly about the damage and the road closures. But there was one paragraph near the end that people noticed. It said that while several larger tow operations had struggled to deploy their modern fleets in the extreme cold, a single operator with a vintage 1952 Holmes wrecker had completed 14 consecutive recoveries through the night. The article didn't name Thornburg's. It didn't need to. Everyone in Scranton knew who had 10 trucks and who had 1. Corbin Thornburg read the article at his kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he folded the newspaper very carefully and set it aside and drank his coffee and said nothing to his wife about any of it. But that afternoon, Corbin lowered his tow rates in South Scranton in the Hill section, dropped from $75 to $45, targeted specifically at the neighborhoods where Sterling had his customer base. It was a price war declared without announcement designed to bleed Sterling's revenue until the math no longer worked. Garrett noticed first, "We're down 30% this month, Sterling. I'm hearing Thornburg's is running at 45 in our neighborhoods." Sterling ran the numbers in his head. $45 was below Thornburg's cost. 10 trucks of building lease insurance, payroll for 6 drivers. The overhead was enormous. Corbin could sustain a loss for a few months, maybe 6, but not longer. Sterling's overhead was his own labor. Garrett's modest salary, gas, oil, and phone bills. At $35 a call, Sterling still made money. Not much, but enough. So Sterling didn't lower his price. He did something Corbin hadn't considered. He called his customers. Every one of them. Not to sell, not to offer discounts, but to check in. How's the car running since we towed it? Your daughter get that fender fixed. Mavis, you need your battery checked before winter. Vivian helped him compile the list. Garrett drove around to the partner garages, dropped off fresh business cards, bought the mechanics coffee, asked about their families. Sterling also signed service agreements with 3 small garages in the area. Free towing for any customer who brought their car to those garages for repair, in exchange for the garages recommending Hadley recovery exclusively. No money changed hands. It was a handshake economy built on relationships instead of rates. 6 months later, Corbin Thornburg raised his prices back to 75. He couldn't sustain the loss. Sterling was still at 35, still making calls, still answering the phone at 3 in the morning. Norma summed it up when she saw Sterling at the shop one afternoon. Thornburg fights with money. You fight with relationships. Money runs out. Relationships don't. In 1989, Nash Kincaid came back for another annual inspection. The homes passed without a single notation, every system compliant, every component within specification. Nash sat in the garage afterward drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup Sterling had offered him. Hadley, I've been inspecting commercial vehicles for 15 years. Every year, every truck I inspect is a little worse than the year before. Rust, wear, deferred maintenance, all of it trending down. Nash took a sip. Your truck is the only one I've ever inspected that's better each year than the year before. I don't know how you do it. I change the oil every 3,000 miles. Grease the fittings, adjust the cable, take care of it. Nash nodded and left. It was the closest thing to admiration Nash Kincaid had ever expressed for anything, and it was the last time he would ever treat the Holmes as anything other than a model of what a commercial vehicle should be. That same year, Clayton's cough got worse. Not gradually, suddenly. One week he was coughing in the mornings. The next week he was coughing all day. The sound changed deeper, wetter, the sound of lungs that were losing a fight they'd been fighting for decades. Clayton still refused to see a doctor, still insisted he was fine. But he stopped coming to the garage. For the first time in Sterling's memory, Clayton was not in the garage in the evenings. He sat in the kitchen instead, or in his bedroom, or on the porch when the weather was warm enough. He didn't explain why. He didn't have to. But every morning when Sterling started the Holmes to go to work, Clayton was at the kitchen window. Sterling saw his father's face in the rearview mirror every time he pulled out of the driveway. Every single morning, Clayton watching the truck leave, Sterling watching Clayton watch. One afternoon in the fall of 1990, Sterling came home early and found Clayton sitting in the cab of the Holmes. The engine was off. The keys were in the ignition, but not turned. Clayton sat behind the wheel with his eyes closed and his hands resting on his thighs, and for a terrible moment, Sterling thought his father was dead. Then Clayton opened his eyes. I miss the sound, he said. It sounds like the mill, like things at work. Sterling walked around to the passenger side, opened the door, and sat down. The cab was small. Their shoulders almost touched. Neither of them spoke. They sat in the still cold cabin of a truck that was older than Sterling, breathing the faint smell of diesel and oil and metal, and Sterling understood for the first time that the Holmes was not just a business asset. It was a bridge between his father's world and his own. The mill was gone, the jobs were gone. The era that had built men like Clayton was gone. But the truck was here. Same iron, same engineering, same refusal to quit. They sat there until the light through the windshield turned orange, then red, then faded. Clayton Hadley died in his sleep on a Tuesday night in April of 1992, peaceful at home in the bed where he'd slept for 30 years. He was 71 years old. Sterling found him in the morning still quiet, his face relaxed in a way it rarely was when he was awake. The cough was finally gone. After the funeral, after the neighbors brought casseroles, and the priest said his words, and Vivian handled the details Sterling couldn't handle, Sterling sat alone in Clayton's bedroom and began cleaning out his father's things. Clayton had owned very little. Work clothes, a few books, and Polish tools that Sterling already had duplicates of a framed photograph of Sterling's mother who had died when Sterling was 3. In the back of the bottom drawer of Clayton's nightstand, Sterling found a notebook. Small pocket, size the kind you could buy at a drugstore for a quarter. The cover was worn soft from years of handling. Sterling opened it and felt the air leave his lungs. Clayton had recorded every tow call Sterling had ever made. Every single one, starting from the first call for Norma's customer in August 1977. Date, location, vehicle type, brief note. The handwriting was small and precise, the penmanship of a man who had spent 30 years filling out maintenance logs at the steel mill. Thousands of entries filling every page front and back with a system of abbreviations Clayton had invented to fit more data into less space. The last entry was dated March 15, 1992, 3 weeks before Clayton died. March 15, 1992, Sterling towed school bus Route 6, all passengers safe. My son. Sterling closed the notebook. He sat on his father's bed for a very long time, holding the small book in both hands, feeling its weight, which was almost nothing and almost everything. Clayton had never once said he was proud, never once told Sterling he was doing a good job, never once acknowledged that the business Sterling had built from a $350 wrecker was remarkable. He had just written it down. Every call, every rescue, every night Sterling went out in the cold to help a stranger. Clayton had tracked all of it silently, privately, in a notebook he kept in his nightstand, where no one would find it until he was gone. Sterling put the notebook in his shirt pocket, where it stayed for the rest of the day and for many days after that. The years between Clayton's death and the summer of 1995 were quiet ones. Sterling ran the business with Garrett and Vivian. Harlan grew up in the garage, a boy surrounded by engines and wrenches, absorbing the trade through proximity, the way Sterling had absorbed it from Clayton. By 10, Harlan could name every tool on the pegboard. By 13, he was changing oil on the International. In 1993, something unexpected happened. Orville Thornburg, Corbin's son, about 20 years old, showed up at Sterling's garage on a Wednesday afternoon. He was a young man with his father's build, but not his father's confidence, fidgeting with his car keys, glancing over his shoulder, as if checking whether anyone had followed him. "Mr. Hadley, I'm looking for work." Sterling studied him. "Your father know you're here. He'd kill me if he knew." Orville swallowed. "Thornburg's is cutting back. Dad let 3 drivers go last month, including me." He paused. "I know it's weird coming here, but I asked around. Everyone I talked to said the same thing. You're fair, you're honest, and you don't play games. Your father would say different." "My father says a lot of things." Orville's voice was careful, measured, the voice of a son who had learned to navigate a difficult parent. "But I'll tell you something. He's never once said a bad word about you behind your back. He'll say it to your face, sure, all day long, but never behind your back. With my dad, that's respect." Sterling didn't hire Orville, not because he held anything against Corbin, but because he understood what it would mean. Corbin Thornburg was losing his business slowly, gradually, imperceptibly, then all at once. Hiring his son would be a public humiliation, and Sterling had no interest in humiliating anyone. He'd been humiliated himself at the auction in front of the whole county, and he remembered what it felt like. Instead, Sterling made a phone call to a tow operator he knew in Wilkes-Barre. Good outfit, honest owner, always looking for young drivers. He gave Orville the name and number. "Go there. Learn the business from somebody who isn't your father and isn't your father's competitor. When you've got enough experience and enough saved, come back and start your own thing." Orville shook Sterling's hand. His grip was strong and his eyes were wet, and he left without another word. Corbin Thornburg never found out his son had walked into Sterling Hadley's garage, but Sterling knew, and knowing changed the way he thought about Corbin. Corbin wasn't a villain. He was a man who had built something the wrong way on debt and ego instead of relationships and patience. He was also a father who had failed to give his son what Clayton had given Sterling, not tools or technique, but the belief that the work itself was enough. By the summer of 1995, Sterling had owned the Holmes for 19 years. The truck had 280,000 miles on it. The paint was faded but intact, the same rust orange it had been since the auction. The engine Clayton had helped rebuild still ran clean and steady. The mechanical winch still lifted. The truck was part of the neighborhood. People recognized its sound before they saw it, the deep rumble of a flathead 6 that hadn't changed its voice in decades. That summer, replacing the cab floor after 19 Pennsylvania winters of road salt, Sterling noticed something that made him stop. The cab was 66 inches wide on the outside. He'd measured it years ago when ordering a replacement floor pan. But when he measured the interior door to door, the number was wrong. 58 inches. 8 inches of space gone. Sterling measured again. Same result. He looked at the wall behind the driver's seat, the panel separating the cab from the engine compartment. It was thicker than it should be. Much thicker. He put his knuckles against it and knocked. The left side was solid. The right side was hollow. Someone had welded a false wall inside the cab. A hidden compartment 8 inches deep running the full width of the truck. Sterling's heart began to pound. He could hear it in his ears, feel it in his fingertips. He reached for his angle grinder, then stopped. Set it down. Sat on the garage floor. 19 years he'd driven this truck. 19 years, 280,000 miles, and he'd never known. Whatever was behind that wall had been there since before the auction. Since before the truck sat in the city garage for 7 years. Since before the man who drove it last had stopped driving forever. Sterling picked up the angle grinder and positioned the blade at the bottom edge of the false panel. The metal was thick, the weld solid, done by someone who knew what they were doing and wanted it to last. He squeezed the trigger. The grinder screamed against the steel. Sparks showered the garage floor. And behind the wall, something waited. The welds gave way in sections, each one popping loose with a sound like a knuckle cracking. Sterling worked the angle grinder slowly, carefully, the way Clayton had taught him to approach anything he didn't fully understand. Not with force, with patience. Let the tool do the work. Let the metal tell you where it wants to separate. The false panel was heavy-gauge steel, thicker than the rest of the cab, welded at the top and bottom by someone with an acetylene torch and the skill to lay a bead that would hold for decades. This was not a rush job. Whoever built this compartment had planned it, measured it, executed it with the precision of someone building for permanence. The bottom edge came free first, then the sides. Sterling pried the panel forward with a flathead screwdriver and felt it swing loose on the remaining top welds like a door on a hinge. Behind it, the air smelled different. Stale sealed the smell of a space that hadn't been open to oxygen since before Sterling had bought the truck. Since before the truck had sat in the city garage. Since 1969. Wedged into the compartment, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed inside a canvas bag that had gone stiff with age, was a metal cash box. Army surplus olive drab, the kind you could buy at any hardware store in the 1960s for $2. Sterling pulled it out. It was heavier than he expected. He set it on the garage floor and knelt beside it. The latch was rusted but functional. He pressed the release, and the lid opened with a metallic groan. Money. Old bills faded, and soft bills so old they felt more like cloth than paper. 5s, 10s, 20s, all of them dated before 1968. Sterling spread them on the floor and counted. Lost count, started again, counted a third time to be sure. $4,800. Under the money was a small notebook different from Clayton's. This one was a city-issued logbook, the kind municipal workers use to track daily activities. On the cover, in faded blue ink, Scranton Department of Public Works Tow Operations Log. Inside every page was filled with handwritten entries. Vehicle type, location, date, fee collected. Entry after entry after entry, each one a record of someone who had needed help and someone who had provided it. 3,247 entries spanning from 1950 to January 1969. Under the logbook was a letter, a single sheet of lined paper folded twice, written in pencil that had faded to a pale gray, but was still legible. The date at the top was January 12, 1969. Sterling sat on the garage floor with the cash box open beside him and the letter in his hands and read, "My name is Wendell Pemberton. If you are reading this, I am probably dead and you found what I hid. I drove this wrecker for the Scranton Department of Public Works from 1950 to 1969. 19 years. Best job I ever had. Helping people. Every day someone needed help and I was there. The city paid me between $3 and $5 per tow call depending on the job. I kept a portion from each call for myself, sometimes $1, sometimes a little more on the bigger jobs. My supervisor said it was all right, a little bonus for the work. Over 19 years, that is this money, $4,800. I never told my wife because she would want to move out of our neighborhood, and I did not want to move. I wanted to buy the corner garage on Pittston Avenue, the one that has been for sale for 5 years. Start my own tow business when I retire in 1970. Serve the neighborhood. Keep helping people. But the doctor says my lungs are shot. All those years breathing exhaust fumes in this cab. Asbestos at the mill before this job. He says I have maybe 6 months. The garage sold last week to someone else. I will never get to use this money now. Whoever finds this, the money is clean. I earned it honest. Maybe you can do what I could not. Maybe you can help people the way I did. This truck saved a lot of people. Let it keep saving. Wendell Pemberton, January 12, 1969. Sterling read the letter twice. Then he set it down on the concrete floor very gently, as if it might disintegrate, and stared at the wall of the garage without seeing it. 19 years. Wendell Pemberton had driven this truck for 19 years. Sterling Hadley had owned it for 19 years. The same number, the same truck, the same dream, a small tow business, serving the neighborhood, helping people, staying close to home. Wendell had saved $1 from each call, 3,247 calls. 3,247 people helped. Everyone recorded in the logbook with the same careful handwriting, the same attention to detail, the same quiet diligence that no one had asked for and no one had known about. And then Sterling's mind made the connection that nearly broke him. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the other notebook, Clayton's notebook, the one he'd carried since the day he found it in his father's nightstand. He opened it and laid it next to Wendell's logbook side by side on the garage floor. 2 notebooks. 2 men who had never met, never known each other, existed separated by decades and connected by a single truck. Both had recorded every act of help in careful handwriting. Both had done it privately, secretly, without telling anyone. Both had died of lung disease. Both had spent their lives in the same few square miles of Scranton. Both had believed that the work mattered more than the recognition. Sterling lost track of time. He wasn't aware of the minutes passing. He wasn't aware of the light changing in the garage, the afternoon sun tracking across the floor, and climbing the wall. He was aware only of the weight of the two notebooks, one in each hand, and the strange, enormous feeling that the truck had carried Wendell's hope for 27 years and delivered it to the one person in Scranton who would understand what it meant. He heard footsteps. Garrett stood in the garage doorway, car keys in hand, ready for the afternoon shift. He saw Sterling on the floor, surrounded by old money and paper, and stopped. "Good Lord, Sterling, what happened?" Sterling handed him the letter. Garrett read it standing up, his lips moving slightly the way he read everything. When he finished, he lowered the letter and looked at Sterling and then at the Holmes and then back at Sterling. "Old Red held on to this for 27 years, Garrett said quietly. "Waited for the right person." "Or the right person waited for the right truck," Sterling said. "I don't know which." Garrett sat down on an overturned bucket. Neither of them spoke for a while. The garage was quiet except for the tick of cooling metal from the Holmes's engine, which Sterling had driven that morning and which was still warm. That night, Sterling lay in bed next to Vivian and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which was unlike her, and when he was done, she asked to see the letter. He turned on the bedside lamp and handed it to her. She read it slowly, holding the paper at the edges, delicate, reverent. "He dreamed the same thing you dreamed," Vivian said. 20 years before I did, in the same truck." Vivian set the letter on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. In the dark, she said, "What are you going to do with the money?" Sterling didn't answer immediately, and in that silence something happened that he was not proud of and that he would later recognize as the most important moment of the entire experience. More important than finding the compartment. More important than reading the letter. He thought about keeping it, all of it, every dollar. The truck was his. He'd paid for it. He'd rebuilt it with his own hands and his father's tools. He'd driven it for 19 years through ice and heat, and Corbin Thornburg's sabotage, and Nash Kincaid's inspections, and the slow grinding work of building something from nothing. $4,800 was not a fortune, but it was real. Harlan was 13, high school next year, college after that. Vivian had been talking about the college fund for months. The money could go there. It was legal. It was found property in a vehicle he owned. No court in the country would make him give it up. Sterling lay in the dark and felt the pull of the money, a quiet gravitational pull. Not overwhelming, just steady, just enough to shift your footing if you let it. Vivian's voice came from the darkness beside him. "You're thinking about keeping it all." It was not a question. She knew him after 15 years of sharing a bed. She could read his silence better than most people read words. "I'm thinking about what kind of man I am," Sterling said. "You already know what kind of man you are. You've known since the day you walked past Corbin Thornburg at the auction." She didn't say anything else. She didn't tell him what to do. She just named the thing he already knew about himself and let him sit with it. In the morning, Sterling drove to the county records office. Wendell Pemberton, born March 3, 1911 in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Employed by the City Department of Public Works from 1950 to 1969. Died March 17, 1969 at age 58. Cause of death, chronic pulmonary disease. Buried at Cathedral Cemetery, Section 14, Row 6. The city had retired the Holmes the same month Wendell died. No one wanted to drive a dead man's truck. It sat in the municipal garage from March 1969 until August 1976. 7 years of stillness. 7 years of Wendell's money and Wendell's letter, waiting in the dark behind the false wall. Wendell's wife, Dorothy, had died in 1982. They had one daughter. Deanne Pemberton, Hartley, in her early 50s, living in Wilkes-Barre. Sterling found her number in the phone book. Before he called, he went to see Garrett at the garage. He needed to say it out loud to someone, not for advice, but to hear his own decision in his own voice and know it was real. If you found $4,800 in your truck, Sterling said, would you keep it? Garrett didn't hesitate. It's your truck, Sterling, your money. Legally, ethically, every which way. But it's not money I earned. Garrett looked at Sterling for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in something closer to awe, with something between admiration and disbelief. You're the kind of man that makes me believe the world isn't completely broken. You know that. Sterling called Deanne Pemberton Hartley at 4 in the afternoon. He introduced himself, explained that he owned a 1952 Holmes wrecker that had previously been operated by the city, and told her what he had found. The compartment, the money, the logbook, the letter. There was silence on the line, long enough that Sterling checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then Deanne's voice came back raw, stripped of composure. My father never told us he was saving money. We thought he died with nothing. We couldn't afford a proper burial. We put him in the cheapest casket the funeral home had. I'm bringing you half the money, Sterling said. $2,400. It was your father's. You should have it. But you found it. You own the truck. You don't owe us anything. Your father earned this money by helping people, Mrs. Hartley. You're his people. 2 days later, Sterling drove the Holmes to Wilkes-Barre. 20 miles on the highway, the 43-year-old truck running steady. The engine Clayton had rebuilt 18 years earlier, holding its rhythm without complaint. Sterling took Route 11 instead of the interstate because the Holmes was more comfortable at 45 than at 65, and because the slower road gave him time to think about what he was going to say. He rehearsed it in his head the way he rehearsed nothing, because Sterling Hadley was not a man who rehearsed. But this was different. He was about to knock on a stranger's door and hand her money that her dead father had hidden inside a truck that Sterling had bought for $350 at a county auction. There was no normal way to do this. There was no script for it. So he drove and he watched the Susquehanna River wind along beside the road, brown and steady, the way rivers in Pennsylvania always are, and he let the words come or not come. Sterling had $2,400 in an envelope on the passenger seat, and in his shirt pocket both notebooks, Clayton's and Wendell's. He couldn't have explained why he brought Clayton's notebook. He just knew it needed to be there. Deanne Pemberton Hartley opened her front door and looked past Sterling to the truck parked at her curb. She froze. Her hand found the door frame and gripped it. That's his truck, she said. That's my father's truck. She had never seen it. Wendell had retired from driving before Deanne was old enough to remember. But her mother, Dorothy, had talked about it. The red truck. The big red truck Daddy drives. Deanne had grown up hearing about a truck she'd never seen, and now it was parked in front of her house, faded and old, and still running 45 years after her father had last turned its key. Sterling gave her the envelope. She opened it, counted the money with trembling fingers, and set it on the hall table. Then he gave her the letter. She read it standing in her doorway, one hand on the frame, and when she reached the part about the garage on Pittston Avenue, she made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, but something in between. He used to drive past that garage every time. Mom always wondered why he slowed down when we passed it. She'd say, "Wendell, what are you looking at?" And he'd just shake his head. Deanne invited Sterling inside. She made coffee in a kitchen that smelled like the kitchens Sterling had grown up around, coffee and dish soap and the faint sweetness of something baked that morning. The house was modest, a 2-bedroom ranch on a quiet street, the kind of house that Wendell H. Pemberton's money could have bought if he'd ever gotten to use it. Sterling noticed a curio cabinet in the hallway with a few pieces of china and a small collection of ceramic figures the accumulated decorations of a life lived carefully on a limited income. On the mantel above a fireplace was a framed certificate from the city of Scranton, some kind of service award dated 1965, made out to Wendell Pemberton for 15 years of municipal service. Deanne saw Sterling looking at it. "That's the only thing from his work we ever had," she said. "Mom kept it on the mantel her whole life. I don't even know if it came with a bonus or just the certificate. Knowing the city, just the certificate." She poured coffee into mismatched mugs and set one in front of Sterling. "Mom used to say Dad loved that truck more than anything. She'd say it like a joke, but I think part of her meant it. I think he was happiest when he was working, when he was helping somebody." On the refrigerator was a single photograph, black and white, held up by a magnet from a plumbing company. Wendell Pemberton standing next to the Holmes wearing a city work uniform, one hand resting on the hood. He was smiling. Not a big smile, a quiet one. The smile of a man who liked where he was and what he was doing. Sterling looked at the photograph for a long time. Wendell's hand on the hood, the same spot where Clayton had placed his hand the night he told Sterling the truck would run another 50 years. The same gesture decades apart. Two men touching the same machine in the same way, both of them believing in what it could do. Dan asked what Sterling would do with his half of the money. He told her. He was going to use it to officially register the business, something he'd been running semi-formally for years, and he was going to change the name. When Sterling returned to Scranton, he drove to the county clerk's office and filed paperwork for a new business entity. Pemberton Hadley Recovery. He paid the registration fees with Wendell's money. Then he went to the garage, opened a can of white paint, and added to the Holmes' door. Below Hadley Recovery, in careful hand-brushed letters, he painted a new line. "In memory of Earl Pemberton, 1911 to 1969, who started this without knowing it." Garrett helped him finish the lettering. When they were done, they stood back and looked at the door. Two names on one truck. Wendell Pemberton and Sterling Hadley, separated by decades, connected by a dream and a machine, and the belief that helping people was worth more than profit. "You know what gets me," Garrett said. "He never met you, never knew you existed, never knew someone would buy this truck and fix it and drive it and build exactly what he wanted to build. But he wrote that letter anyway. He wrote it to nobody, and it found you." The story spread. In a town like Scranton, stories travel through diners and barbershops and church halls faster than they travel through newspapers. Within a month, everyone in the tow business in northeastern Pennsylvania knew about the money in the Holmes, the letter from the dead driver, and what Sterling Hadley had done with it. Norma heard it from a customer. Nash Kincaid heard it from a colleague. The Scranton Times-Tribune ran a feature longer this time, page one of the local section, with a photograph of the Holmes and the two names on its door. Corbin Thornburg heard it too. Everyone made sure of that. In 1996, Thornburg's Heavy Recovery filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The court records told a story that Sterling had guessed years ago but never confirmed. Corbin had financed every expansion with debt. Every new truck, every building upgrade, every contract bid had been leveraged against future revenue that was never guaranteed. When the economy softened and the highway contracts were renegotiated downward, the revenue dropped below the debt service, and the whole structure folded like a house of cards in a draft. The blue and gold trucks were auctioned off to pay creditors. The building on Moosic Street went back to the landlord. The name that had once dominated every highway ramp in Lackawanna County disappeared from the roads entirely. A few months after the bankruptcy filing, on a Thursday afternoon in late October, Sterling pulled the Holmes into a gas station on Moosic Street to fill up. He was alone. Garrett had taken the International on a call, and the station was quiet. He was standing at the pump when a pickup truck pulled in on the other side. Not a new pickup, an older Ford several years old, a dent in the rear quarter panel, a truck chosen for function, not appearance. Corbin Thornburg got out. They saw each other at the same moment. Sterling on one side of the pump island, Corbin on the other, 6 feet of concrete and 20 years of history between them. Corbin looked older, not just aged, diminished. The pressed shirts were gone. He wore a plain work jacket, unembroidered, the jacket of a man who worked for someone else now. His hands, Sterling noticed, were no longer clean. There was grease under his fingernails. Corbin Thornburg was doing his own mechanical work for the first time in years, maybe decades. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The pump clicked and hummed. Traffic passed on Moosic Street. A cold wind blew across the lot, carrying the smell of gasoline and dead leaves. Corbin walked over. He stopped about 3 feet from Sterling, close enough to talk without raising his voice, far enough to maintain the distance that had existed between them for 2 decades. He looked at the Holmes, at the 2 names on the door, at the faded red paint and the rebuilt engine and the mechanical winch that had pulled 14 cars out of a blizzard in one of his own trucks off a highway shoulder. "I was wrong about the truck," Corbin said. 6 words. No preamble, no qualification, no excuse. Sterling understood what those 6 words had cost a man like Corbin Thornburg. Corbin had built his entire identity on being right, on having the answers, on knowing what things and people were worth. Admitting he was wrong about the truck meant admitting he was wrong about Sterling, about the auction, about all of it. Sterling didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say, "I know." He didn't mention the inspection with Nash Kincaid or the price war or the night he'd towed Corbin's broken truck out of a blizzard without leaving a bill. He said, "The truck was never the issue, Mr. Thornburg. You and I just played 2 different games." Corbin's eyes moved to the name on the door. Pemberton. He'd heard the story. Everyone had. "I heard about the old driver, the letter, what you did with the money." He paused. "That was a good thing." Corbin nodded once, barely perceptible. Then he looked at the Holmes again, really looked at it the way someone studies a thing they've spent 20 years misunderstanding. The faded paint, the hand-brushed letters, the cracked windshield that Sterling had never replaced, the mechanical winch that had pulled Corbin's own truck out of a blizzard 9 years ago. Corbin put his hand on the hood briefly, almost unconsciously, and Sterling felt his throat tighten because it was the same gesture, the same spot on the hood where Clayton had rested his hand the night he said the truck would run another 50 years. The same spot where Wendell Pemberton had placed his hand in the photograph on Deanne's refrigerator. 3 men decades apart touching the same piece of metal, each of them recognizing something in it that had nothing to do with horsepower or torque or resale value. Corbin pulled his hand back as if he'd touched something hot. Whether he knew what he'd just done, whether he felt what Sterling felt in that moment, neither of them would ever discuss. He turned and walked back to his truck. No handshake, no embrace, no cinematic reconciliation. Just 2 men at a gas station, one of them acknowledging with 6 words that the other had been right about something fundamental, and the other accepting the acknowledgement without triumph or satisfaction. The way men of that generation settled accounts, quietly, without ceremony, with just enough said and nothing more. Corbin drove away. Sterling finished filling the tank, hung up the nozzle, and sat in the cab of the Holmes for a minute before starting the engine. He looked at the 2 names on the door reflected in the side mirror. Pemberton and Hadley. A man who'd dreamed it and a man who'd built it. Neither of them alone. Both of them together, joined by a truck that had outlasted everything, the mockery and the doubt and the debt and the blizzards and the bureaucrats and the decades. Sterling started the engine. The Holmes rumbled to life steady and sure, the way it had every day for 18 years and would continue to for many more. In 2000, Hadley Recovery owned 3 wreckers, all vintage, all paid for in cash. The Holmes, the 1965 International, and a 1970 Ford F600 that Sterling had bought from a retiring operator in Carbondale. The company had 3 employees, including Garrett, a proper phone line with an answering service and a small office that Vivian had set up in the front room of the house on Birch Street. Corbin Thornburg was working as a dispatcher for a tow company in Dunmore, taking calls for someone else riding a desk instead of running a fleet. In 2015, Sterling retired. He was 65 years old and his knees had started to protest the climbing and crawling that tow work demanded. He handed the business to Harlan, who had grown up in the garage, who had learned engines the way Sterling had learned them by taking things apart and putting them back together under the supervision of a man who believed that silence was the best teacher. Harlan kept the name, Pemberton Hadley Recovery. He kept the Holmes, too. The truck was 63 years old by then and still running, still taking calls, still starting on the first turn of the key every morning. Harlan had offered to retire it, put it in the garage as a display piece, maybe take it to car shows on weekends. Sterling shook his head. That truck wasn't built to sit. It was built to work. Let it work. Deanne Pemberton Hartley's son, Wendell's grandson, came to work for the company in 2010. His name was Leland, and he was 24 years old, almost exactly the age Sterling had been when he'd bought the Holmes at auction. Leland had his grandfather's build, broad shoulders, thick forearms, and his grandfather's temperament, quiet, steady, the kind of person who listened more than he talked and worked more than he complained. Sterling recognized something in him immediately, not family by blood, family by disposition. The kind of man who understood that showing up mattered more than showing off. On Leland's first day, Sterling handed him the keys to the Holmes and said, "Your grandfather drove this truck for 19 years. I've driven it for 33. Treat it the way we treated it, and it'll outlast all of us." Leland took the keys, climbed into the cab, and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. He didn't say anything. He just ran his hand along the dashboard, feeling the texture of 70 years of use, and Sterling saw in that gesture the echo of every hand that had ever touched this truck with something more than utility, with gratitude, with recognition, with the quiet acknowledgement that some machines become more than machines when enough good men pour their lives into them. Leland drove the Holmes on occasion, and every time he did, he touched the name on the door before he climbed in. His grandfather's name, the grandfather he'd never met, whose dream had waited in the dark for 27 years and then traveled 19 more before landing exactly where it was supposed to. By 2024, the Holmes was 72 years old. Sterling was 74. The truck had outlasted every prediction, every joke, every expert opinion about what a $350 wrecker could and couldn't do. It had outlasted Thornburg's heavy recovery and its fleet of financed Chevrolets. It had outlasted Clayton's lungs and Wendell's lungs in the steel mill that had damaged them both. It had outlasted the laughter at the auction and the condescension of a man who thought he knew the price of everything. On a summer evening in 2024, Sterling sat in the garage on Birch Street, the same garage where Clayton had taught him to fix things one piece at a time. The Holmes was parked in its usual spot, engine cooling the tick of contracting metal the only sound. Harlan's son, Sterling's grandson, was wiping down the fenders with a rag the way Harlan used to, the way Sterling used to, the way Clayton would have, if anyone had ever let him near a rag without putting a wrench in his hand instead. The boy looked up. "Grandpa, why don't we get a new truck?" Sterling looked at the Holmes. At the two names on the door, white paint on faded red, the letters hand-brushed and imperfect and enduring. At the windshield that still had a crack running corner to corner, the original crack from 1976 that Sterling had never bothered to fix because it didn't affect the driving, and because in some way he couldn't articulate, it felt like part of the truck's face. Because this truck kept a promise, Sterling said. A man named Wendell Pemberton put his hope inside it 46 years before I found it. The truck held on to that hope through 7 years of sitting in a city garage and 19 years of me driving it and never knowing. It waited. It waited until someone who would understand was the one to open it up. The boy didn't fully understand. He was young. He would understand later the way Sterling had understood Clayton's lessons later, the way all important things are understood not when they're given, but when they're needed. When people asked Sterling about the money, he didn't talk about the money. He talked about Wendell Pemberton, about a man who had helped 3,247 people over 19 years and recorded every single one, about a dream that waited 27 years in the dark and then came true in a way its dreamer never could have imagined. The truck didn't just carry money, Sterling would say. It carried a man's hope. And it waited until someone who would finish the job was the one who found it. The people who laughed at the auction in 1976 didn't laugh anymore. Most of them didn't remember that day at all. It was 50 years ago. The auctioneer was long dead. The crowd had dispersed into the ordinary amnesia of time. But Sterling remembered. He remembered the laughter and the heat and the $18-20 bills and the look on Corbin Thornburg's face and the silence of Norma Loomis and the sound of his own voice bidding against himself in an empty field. And he remembered what his father had taught him, not with words, because Clayton Hadley didn't believe in words. With a wrench and a garage and a cough that got worse every year, and a notebook filled with every good thing his son had ever done, kept secret until the end. Sterling Hadley paid $350 for a wrecker that everyone called junk. He spent 19 years fixing it, driving it, trusting it. He found $4,800, a dead man's dream, and a purpose that was bigger than profit and older than he was. Not a bad return on $350. The Holmes 440 still runs, still carries Wendell's name on the door, still proves every morning when the key turns and the engine catches and the old machine shudders to life that the things we dismiss often hold the most meaning, that the things we laugh at are sometimes the things that last the longest, and that sometimes if you're patient enough and stubborn enough and decent enough, the truck you buy for $350 at a county auction will give you back something no amount of money could ever purchase. Every time a young tow operator asks Sterling for advice, he tells them the same thing. Don't buy the flashiest truck on the lot. Buy the one that'll still be running when the payments on the flashy one are 6 months overdue. He pauses the way Clayton used to pause, letting the silence do the teaching. And remember, sometimes the treasure isn't money. Sometimes it's knowing that you finished what someone else started. The 1952 Holmes sits in the garage on Birch Street tonight. The paint is faded. The windshield is cracked. The name on the door reads Pemberton Hadley Recovery, and below it in smaller letters that you have to step close to read, in memory of Wendell Pemberton, 1911 to 1969, who started this without knowing it. The engine is cold now, but it will start in the morning. It always does.